tetragrammaton.
How do you think growing up in Iceland impacts your playing?
It's a little bit like asking, almost like, how did your mother influence you? You know, it's like, it's so deeply rooted in those of us who come from that weird little island.
Yeah.
Actually, not so little.
Yeah.
Because it's actually weirdly big, but with such few people.
Yeah.
But full of volcanoes and glaciers.
Islands are very specific, though. It's different being on an island.
There's an island mentality, I'm afraid.
Yeah.
For better or for worse,
For better or for
right?
worse, yeah.
No, I think there's a certain kind of an instability about an island in that specific location in the North Atlantic Ocean, where with the kind of volcanic eruptions every third year, it seems these days, and the earthquakes and the high contrast between the seasons. You know, we have basically two seasons. The dark and the bright season, the winter and the summer, and every year, you know, the idea of autumn and spring is just a deception, and we fall for it every year, you know, because you might have snow in May, and you never know what's going to happen.
Icelandic winter is May?
No, Icelandic winter is basically from October. So we just have a summer season like June, whatever, July, August, but it's brief and it's wonderful, and it's you know, it has white nights, so you know, complete daylight. It's amazing to actually make music at summer solstice in Iceland. You know, it's amazing. But it has the light, but it also has the kind of focus of the slightly colder temperatures. You know, the kind of crispness of the air. But I think also growing up in Iceland is a different question to ask like me as opposed to asking my sons, because growing up in the 90s is such a, in retrospect, wonderful thing. Growing up without the internet, without YouTube, and without all of it, right? Without Spotify and all those things. It's kind of so wonderful to grow up not aware of anything really outside of your little island, and just get the kind of luxury of being the best at playing piano. Building your sort of, you know, I thought of myself as an international pianist since I was like 10, and I wasn't, of course. But that's how I defined myself.
That's interesting,
right?
That's an interesting idea, that you thought of yourself that way at a young age.
I think it's something that many people have in common who do something like this, to define themselves quite early on, whether they admit it or not.
Yeah.
When I met my first piano teacher, I was 5, and I was actually accompanying my older sister to her music school, and we were picking her up or something, and I met this lady, Erla Stefánsdóttir, who was a very famous person in Iceland, not for her piano teaching, but for seeing through mountains and believing in elves and sort of different worlds. She was a very spiritual woman. And she asked me, would you like to learn how to play the piano? And 5-year-old me said, I know how to play the piano.
Wow, good answer.
Which was ridiculous.
Good answer.
But I felt like I knew how. I knew how to play the piano my way.
Yeah.
You know, I played the piano.
Yeah.
So.
And did she become your teacher?
She did.
And
I started studying with her.
Tell me about that. Tell me what it's like learning to play piano from somebody. What is that like?
It's it was wonderful, because she was. Maybe she was a great teacher and not a great teacher. You know, she was great in that she just inspired joy with the music. So there were not so many mistakes, but not so great perhaps because there weren't so many mistakes. So it wasn't the most disciplined way of teaching. But she always put me at the end of the day for her schedule, so she could spend extra time with me, and we would just go on and on and on, and I would just play, and we would think she was enjoying it as much as I did. But it was basically about the fundamental joy of getting that response from the piano. Just, you know, having that dialogue with the instrument that started early on. So she would never make me play really scales or all the kind of strict technical academic exercises that we then have to go through at some point, most of us. It was just the response to music. So I was very lucky in that way.
Would she play for you?
A little bit, no, not much, almost nothing. She would just smile at me.
Yeah.
But that was the kind of feeling, you know, it was for joy. It wasn't for suffering.
Was it a feeling of acceptance, or how would you describe what you felt from her?
Acceptance, absolutely, is a good word. But I think also just celebration, you know. So she was a very spiritual woman, and you could see how touched she was by the music, and that affects you as a child very early on, and you learn from that as much as from the skill of actually playing the piano. You learn, you know, by seeing people being inspired, it grows something inside you. I believe that now. So I think it was free, but, you know, there were no piano competitions. There was no direct comparison. I was simply the best there was in that school.
Yeah.
and that was it, you know. So I would never practice out of duty. And my mother, who was a piano teacher, and my father, architect and a composer, they would rather encourage me to not play the piano quite so much and just go out and play football with my friends and do whatever, just be a normal kid. That was more the direction, you know. And they would always, whenever there was media attention on me as a kid, they would turn it down just to keep everything very, very, very private.
Do you remember the first time you played in front of people?
Yeah, when I was 5, 6, first year. And I remember it was hilarious, actually, because I was told not to forget to bring my music book with me on stage. But, you know, I always memorized things and I learned them by heart.
Yeah.
So 5-year-old me just thought, okay, I'm supposed to bring the music book. And I brought the book sort of under my hand, like here. And then I didn't know what to do with it. So I played the whole concert with the book here and my elbow like this. I just sort of playing. And then I sort of like took a bow and left the stage and was like, well, what's the deal with the book? So that's how you do it. But I mean, playing for people was always something I looked forward to. Yeah. I didn't realize, you know, that things could really go wrong. So it's a privileged way of being.
How different is playing the same piece in a room by yourself versus playing it in a theater full of people? For you, how is the experience different?
It's not one experience or two experiences to compare. It's like every night is different, just like we are different from day to day. So I feel like it's a discovery, like every single concert. But yeah, there are two sides, the introvert and the extrovert side, you know, and I think we need both. Just like I need the studio, which is the introvert side, and then I need Carnegie Hall, which is the extrovert side. Couldn't be without people, though, you know. But I think about this all the time. What should be the proportion in my musical life as a pianist? Live touring, which today is actually quite extensive, and then the home time, the sort of scheduled time for nothing, but then for everything perhaps to happen. And I'm drawn more and more to the idea of going into 50-50 splits, you know. And I think that's something that has been lacking a little bit in my life in the last 10 years. It's been incredibly busy. Basically touring the whole world and trying to get to know my audience and allowing my audience to get to know me a little bit. But I see it different now. I've just turned 40, you know, and I see a different decade ahead. And I want to really, what do I want? I think I want to like make Glenn Gould turn in his grave with jealousy of the kind of live in the studio. I mean, imagine if sort of an ideological man like him would have actually had the luxury of the modern studio with all the creative possibilities that technology affords us. So I want to go more into that. But, you know, it's a little bit like the studio is where you tell people very confidential things and you whisper your secrets to the microphone. The concert is something else. It can be very intimate and it can be very personal, but it's never entirely intimate. There's always 3,000 or whatever it is, 2,000 people, whatever the size. And so that's always a mix. But I'm building my own studio now under my own house, happening right now in Reykjavik, and that is yeah, that is my gift to myself. I know you know that gift very well, having built all these studios around the whole world.
There's something about having a place to make music that is not a corporate environment, but first of all, windows. It's really, having windows in the studio is really nice.
Absolutely.
Changes everything.
Yeah, I went for the golden ratio in the kind of shoebox size of that. My whole house is a gorgeous house from 1960s in Iceland, perfect sort of, for me, time in architecture. And we just analyzed the house, and I don't know if it was on purpose, but the whole house is in the golden ratio, my favorite ratio. So of course we've done the studio like that as well.
You say that your first teacher had a spiritual relationship to music. Would you say you have a spiritual relationship to music?
Music is my spirituality, absolutely. Yeah.
How do you describe the connection, you and music?
It's like plants and water, you know. It's my water.
It feeds you.
It feeds me.
Yeah.
Do we feed the music? I don't think so. You know, we gain from the oxygen. I think we get from the water.
Yeah.
But you know, it is. I love it more and more, I guess. The older I get and the closer to death, you know, we are in our lives, the more it seems to matter to me.
Mm.
When I was young, it was a game, and now it is something more than that, you know.
Is there ever a time when you're playing in front of people where you forget that there are people there?
All the time. All
You
the time.
just
Are you joking? Yeah, I'm
no.
afraid. All the time. But I think that's sometimes the aim, and sometimes it's not the aim. Sometimes, you know, for instance, if you play in the BBC Proms and you have, like, you know, all these people there and they're just there on the floor with you, you don't really forget about them because they're in your face.
Mm-hmm.
But you almost always turn my audience into it's a very dark room that I have. It's a very single spotlight, very simple setup, where I want to have the luxury of being able perhaps to forget about everything and forgetting about myself as well. Sometimes it's like when I'm playing the Goldberg Variations of Bach, it feels like a meeting with him somewhere in between 2024 and 1741 when the piece was written. You know, it's a strange thing. You know, Philip Glass said music is a place, you know, as real as any place you've ever been to. I think it's a wonderful quote. So we go to that place, and that's maybe the goal.
It's the unspeakable mystery, the representation of a sound wave from which everything springs. Tetragrammaton is an online collection of curated material. Is it a library or a gallery? A museum? An oracle? We hope to find out. You mentioned when Bach lived, and when I hear you play Bach's music, it's written 300 years ago. When I hear you play it, it feels completely modern to me. And I don't completely understand it, how it works. You're not changing the music. You're playing the music as it was written. But for some reason, you're bringing something modern to it. Is it something you're aware of or aim for, or is it just an organic thing that happens?
Well, I'm glad you think it's modern, because I feel very much like Bach's music is more modern than anything I play by any living composer. And I work with some of the very finest composers. He seems to me always to be the future. Why is that? You say that it's true that I don't change the music, but I do change the music, because I don't change the notes and the proportions of rhythm inside the score. But that's where it ends, because he doesn't write almost anything about how to shape those notes. There are almost no dynamic markings. The tempo markings are so open and so broad. And anyway, what do we know about how people felt the time in the 18th century when the horse was the fastest way of traveling? Of course, Bach couldn't have dreamt about the modern grand piano that I'm using. But I feel like is a weirdly minimal, maximal sort of tension in Bach. Maximal in terms of the greatest musical structures ever created, in my opinion, and minimal in the sense that they're completely open. So an old man said to me late in the 20th century that Bach is a free country.
Wow.
It's beautiful. It stays with me. His name was György Sebek, who's a very great Hungarian pianist. Bach is a free country. And I think of that all the time. And then I feel like with Bach, you have to take a stance in so many different ways in every single moment in time. In every measure, you make so many decisions in the moment and different in each performance, So when you play the Goldberg Variations 2 nights in a row, it's really 2 different pieces. But I think, so in a way, you feel very much like a co-creator in a very sort of compositional sense with Bach, even if you're playing his sort of, eternal text. You are still, in a way, creating and such a big part of it. And to play that music, which is built as much on sort of harmonic blocks, but even more on the sort of linear, on the horizontal, on the way these voices and the texture on this polyphony, how you have 2, 3, 4, 5 voices sort of speaking to each other just like actors on a stage, where you sometimes feel almost like a theater director when you're playing Bach, giving these different voices their unique roles and allowing some to take the spotlight, but always to keep the supporting actors absolutely alive, as in any good staging of a play. That's how it can feel with Bach. You feel sometimes more like a director than a pianist. And to then bring that to the studio and to think about how we record the piano, which is a very difficult thing to do, actually, with success, to get the 3-dimensionality of the piano as opposed to that very often 2-dimensionality and push it in your face approach of piano recordings. That is one of the most fascinating challenges and one of the most creative things I know. To me, as creative, dealing with the microphone setup before the Goldberg Variations recording, as perhaps writing my own music or doing whatever, arranging something, it's so interesting how moving the microphones a centimeter here or there changes the narrative, For instance, in the Goldbergs, we actually placed, for the first time I tried this, 2 mics just above my head, because I wanted to really give people, the listeners, the impression that they were basically playing the piece themselves almost, So the sound and the way we record with Christopher Tano, he's my dear soulmate producer, and Christian Batsura as well, my wonderful A&R from Deutsche Grammophon Universal. The way we do that is such a musical joy, and that's why I mentioned earlier Glenn Gould and how I wish he had the kind of opportunities that we have today, Yeah.
One of the things that really strikes me as modern about your playing is it has to do with a rhythmic interpretation that, again, I think if you were to look at the music, if you look at the music, it hasn't changed, but there's some internal rhythmic thing going on when you play it that's not in Glenn Gould, and that I hear the person playing now, he's heard hip-hop music. He's listened to hip-hop music. I'm not saying it's inspired by hip-hop music, but it's played in a world where hip-hop music exists, and I can feel those inner rhythms that I don't hear in old recordings, even the greatest old recordings. And that brings a modernity to it that makes it brings it even more to now.
I like the idea of hearing like Kendrick Lamar and the Goldberg Variations. That's hilarious. Going back to Gould, I mean, his favorite artist in those days in the 70s or 60s was Barbara Streisand.
Oh, fantastic. I didn't know that.
She's amazing. But yeah, I mean, we have to embrace our times. We can't escape them. That's why I always think it's interesting, but sometimes a little bit arrogant when people pretend to know the correct historical way of playing music, old music. It's so strange, as if the composers would play the Goldberg Variations twice the same. If Bach was here today in Los Angeles, coming to Disney Hall, would he play the same tempos, the same expression? Would the piece tell him the same narrative 2 nights in a row? I'd bet my right kidney it's not going to be the same. you know. No, but I think we have to embrace it. And coming from my little island, Iceland, I think this is one of the perks of coming from that island, that we do many different things out of necessity, perhaps. We are very few, and it's a very small and very intense musical scene. I'm not so much a part of it anymore because I'm just sort of always somewhere out in the world. But, you know, as a teenager, I played in a big band, you know, and I've done, you know, rock quintet, you know, improvisations, a little bit like in Emerson, Lake and Palmer style, you know. I've done my weird things as well. And I think people back home in the symphony orchestra, some of them play heavy metal on Friday nights, having played a Mahler symphony on a Thursday, which is to be celebrated. You know, I did my duet with Björk, etc. That's like so many, and so I think perhaps that has to feed into the way you play music, and perhaps in particular how you play Baroque music, and even more in particular how you play Johann Sebastian Bach. I think he becomes very easily a mirror for those who play him and for those who listen to him.
Yeah, to me, the music is Baroque, but your interpretation is not, even though it's very by the book. It's like you're not reinventing the wheel. That's what's so interesting to me about it, is how it can be so similar and so different at the same time.
Yeah,
that's my experience as a listener.
Sometimes I just think, like, when you're making a record, and I wonder how you feel about that. Like, the one thing you need to always be is specific. You know, and when you play Bach, in terms of rhythm, in terms of the exact voicing of what you're doing and the exact proportion of time you steal there on that note and then give back in the following measure, how specific can you go? And if you go specific, usually you go honest, because being specific means you have to search somewhere, I think, beyond your ego. You know, if you really want to be specific, you go beyond yourself almost. So I think that is sometimes what happens. And I think what you are trying to describe, I think, you know, every recording is different, but they all have to be specific.
Is everything always intentional, or does it just come out that way sometimes? Do you know what I'm saying?
I think life is incredibly improvisatory. I think sometimes I work really hard, you know, and I'm quite serious about what I do. And I don't ever feel like I'm really working. I play. But I think I make so many decisions in the process of preparing just in order to forget them in the moment of doing. So yeah, you study to be able to forget everything in the moment and do something completely different. And that's because I feel like, actually, with myself at least, maybe I think it might be lack of talent, but I think like I actually need to go through that insane process of sometimes overthinking and, you know, over deciding everything in order to surprise myself and allow my subconsciousness to sort of take over a little bit.
How different are performances for you night to night?
Sometimes very different, but pianos are different, and audiences are different. I mean, when you play, let's just take two cities, like let's say New York and Tokyo. So when you play in Carnegie Hall and Suntory Hall, come onto the stage in Carnegie Hall and it's a Friday night and it's a party and you feel the vibes. You come onto the stage and you have what I think is the greatest acoustic in the world. Sounds like a cliche because it's Carnegie Hall, but actually that cliche is true. And you play a performance and it's that Friday night in Carnegie Hall with those people in that mode. And then you go to Suntory Hall in Tokyo and you have the most unbelievably beautiful audience, and they applaud, and the applause is so rapid. You know, they really work for the applause there. And then you sit down and
silence,
like a zipper, you know. And I always, when that happens, I always think, oh, I've just lost my hearing. It just feels like, oh God, it's like a vacuum, you know. And then you play, and it's a very different occasion, and it becomes sometimes perhaps more sacred, can you say? Or, you know, sort of maybe elevated. But it's just different, and it's not better.
Just
Perhaps
different.
I prefer the human element there in Carnegie Hall, you know, even if a cell phone goes off in variation 15 or something, you know. But just these two concerts, just to give you one, you know, I played the Goldberg Variations now, and I don't know, I've stopped counting, but I think it's 96 or 7 concerts or something like that, almost everywhere in the world. And I've had that, you know, that night. I think I'm on concert 85 or something tomorrow in Disney Hall, and I'm not tired with the music because I feel like I'm doing at this point the 85th variation on the Goldberg Variations.
Yeah.
The piano is a living creature. You know, people don't realize sometimes that one grand piano has 12,000 plus parts, and they are living and breathing, I dare say. It's wood, and it's you know, steel, and it's iron, and it's screws, you know, but it's strings, and every temperature that goes up 1 degree or 2 changes the piano, changes us. And yeah, the piano is a society in a way. So and that society is not stable, and no society is stable, nor should it be. It's very living. So yeah, if the humidity goes up 5%, I feel it in the piano, and that comes through in my music making and the choices I make on stage.
Do you think the energy in the audience goes beyond what you hear? In other words, you described 2 different audiences. One's noisy, one's silent. If you took the sound equation out of it, being in the room with those different groups of people, would it feel different in the room?
Yeah, don't you think so?
I think so, but I want to know what you think.
Yeah, but we're having a dialogue.
Yeah. Well,
yeah, I think so, inevitably. But I'm more and more interested now also just in every room as an instrument, you know. I was just reading about Carnegie. I was wondering why do I love it so much, right? And I found this book. Someone sent me a page from a book that is like, I think it must be about, you know, 100 years old, this book, but it did sound measurements, sound duration for different pitches. Turns out that the duration of both the low frequencies and the higher frequencies and everything that are in between in Carnegie Hall is remarkably even. So that the room really resonates basically all over as it does on the stage, you know, close to the instruments, which is so beautiful because most rooms with the bigger lower frequencies, they cancel out the smaller birds.
Yeah. Have you played at Disney Hall before?
Yeah, many times.
And how's that experience?
It's beautiful. It's completely different because it's a vineyard kind of a setting where you have audience, you know, everywhere around you. Yeah. So it's beautiful. It's not Carnegie Hall, but it's such a good atmosphere.
And how is it different playing Bach in Germany, in Leipzig, versus playing it in New York or playing it in Iceland?
It's a good question. I think sometimes when you have that much tradition, I sometimes wonder how is it to come from the country of Bach and Beethoven and Wagner and all of them. When you have that much tradition, I wonder if you bring with yourself slightly more baggage to the occasion. I don't know. I feel like the response is they love the music so dearly in Germany, and they're so proud of it, and it's such an amazing crowd I have there. And they're so serious about it that perhaps they lose some of their freedom in response to it because it has such a history. It's wonderful sometimes to play for some of my audience, like in Vienna, actually, where you do have that history. But I played 2 nights, and on the second night, because the first one sold out quite fast, and then you had all these young people, and the Viennese press wrote about what are all those genes doing in our concert hall? Yeah. You know, because it was all young people, and I thought that was a great response, and you felt the difference. You know?
Absolutely.
I think it can be wonderful not to have too much history. That's why perhaps being a performer or a pianist from Iceland, and in a way the first Icelandic touring pianist, I guess, or soloist, is gives me a bit of freedom because I don't have the whole Russian piano school behind me as some of the Russians do.
Yeah.
And I don't have the French piano school, to worry about.
Yeah.
There is no piano school.
And do you surprise yourself when you're playing?
Yeah. Sometimes you have these moments where you're just sort of observing it from I guess you could call it, I don't want to say it, but like almost you go out of yourself. I'm not going to say out of body experience because you're very much in the act of doing it. But sometimes it's almost as if you zone up a few meters and you just sort of observe it. When you fly, I think so many people who do this know that feeling, and it's thankfully rare because it then means something when it happens. But there can be also just these moments when the music also takes you in a difficult direction yourself, in your own thought process with your memory and your own past experiences and sometimes sorrows, tragedies. So sometimes when I play parts of the Goldberg Variations, I feel like getting a glimpse to what it must feel like to be at sort of the end of your life. And sometimes it brings back pain from my past, of course. I think we all go through that on stage one way or another, if we are sincere enough about it and open up to it. But like the Goldberg Variations, they can so easily be read like a life cycle, if you wish. You can also completely oppose that, but you can see them as, the beautiful aria, which is like ode to life, birth of something magnificent, precious, fragile. And then you have the first 14 variations, which all have one thing in common. They just use the same chord structure as the aria. Just this beautiful, simple G major structure. And they're like 14 different phases in a happy childhood that doesn't know shadow, doesn't know pain. And then variation 15, quite deep into the piece, hits you in G minor, and he sort of goes into the negative. Light becomes shadow. And we have this sort of unbearable suffering, and it's a little bit like in life when we first encounter that. When we first encounter human loss, someone in our family, whatever that is, different for each and every one of us, nothing prepares you for it, and it can feel very much like that in the Goldberg Variations, Variation 15, just exactly in the middle of the piece. And then you have a break, and Variation 16 is an overture, like the beginning of something new again, and we have to bounce back. But we are different. We've gone through that tragedy once. And then you have the same thing happening in 21 and 25. And really in Variation 25, he does something that is so magnificent that really hard to justify talking about it almost.
Yeah.
But he expands time in a way that, he zones in on the chords, and what is usually a 2-minute variation turns into something like a 10-minute variation. And he goes into the most excruciatingly painful chromatic musical language. He goes to the sort of brink of what you can express and how much you can open up that compartment in your soul. It's a dark compartment. It's so painful. And I think about Bach, and I think about the fact that he had lost 10 out of 20 children, I think, at this point. And he had lost his first wife from, I think she was giving birth. And he had so much difficulty and, in a way, modest success. And there he was, I think, history's greatest, not just musician, but perhaps just artist. I don't know if anyone can really match this. And he's all alone, but he bounces back. And Variation 26, 7, 8, 9, 30, they sort of go in a flurry, and it just sort of like, you go back and you hold on to it, and it becomes this celebration and this sort of, I am going to, emerge from this victorious no matter what, like we think in life. But then the surprising thing happens in the masterstroke where he brings the aria back, and it's the exact same notes as in the beginning, but they've taken on a completely different meaning, and those same chord structures now reflect those 30 different periods in our life, these 30 different chapters. And when this piece comes to an end, That's actually, it's strange to say because we are just in G major and it's just sort of like goes into the sunset. But it is one of the most tragic moments I know in all of music. And it's tragic sort of on a personal level because you don't want the music to end. You don't want that aria to end. You want to hold on to it just like you want to hold on to life. And you have the feeling when the aria comes back that it's just on the mixer board and you just sort of like, you taking it down and then you sort of like, it's been playing there all along. It's eternal. It is sort of the foundation of the world in this piece. And you feel your own end is coming, but the aria will go on. You know, just like life goes on, but we do not go on. And that's how it can very often feel when you're playing. You know, you go to that place in yourself, you go to that place of personal experience. It's strange things to do with music that somebody else wrote, but while you're in the act of playing the Goldberg Variations, you merge with them in a way that you become them. And
it's the power of the music. You can't help but merge with them.
I think when you play King Lear, you become Lear.
Yeah. And the audience gets to experience just like you do. It's like the power's in the music.
Yeah, it's incredible. And you have all these people in the room.
Yeah.
And paradoxically, they are absolutely sort of communal together in a collective, and it's the most beautiful thing in human sort of brother and sisterhood you can imagine. And at the same time, it's the most individualistic thing in the world because everyone is in their own place, and they're all very often somewhere in their own life story. And Bach reflects that very easily in this piece and in much of his music. He invites you to discover yourself. When you play Beethoven, whom I love almost equally, you're a guest in his world, and he invites you to explore different facets of him. But Bach, he becomes your mirror, you know. But it's that thing at the end of the Goldberg Variation when people, you know, everybody wants to hold on to it, which is why the silence is tragic.
Did you feel obligated to get into the Goldberg Variations, to record it and to play it? It's a funny thing because it's such a monumental piece and it means so much, but there's a lot of great pieces. And tell me about the decision to do it, why you chose to do it, when you chose to do it, and did you feel any sense of obligation?
It's a big question. You know, to give an honest answer to it, you have to sort of go back quite a few years.
Yeah.
When I first heard this music, it changed the way I thought about not just Bach, but about all music and about recordings. I heard when I was 14, I think I was 14, I heard the recording of Glenn Gould on Columbia.
The early or the late?
The early one first. And I just remember my head and my heart sort of exploding. I was 14. It's a great year to hear the Goldberg Variations for the first time. It's just the right time, I think. And up until that point, I had played a lot of Bach, but he was used in my musical upbringing very much to teach good musical manners. How to play even rhythm, control everything, not too much pedal, know how to do this kind of trick here and that kind of trill there and blah, blah, blah. You know, so Bach was all about, it was complex music, it was mathematical, it was structural. It wasn't poetic yet to me. Just that connection hadn't been made in my head. And then I heard the Goldberg Variations, Gould, and I realized that indeed Bach is a free country and that he can be so many things at the same time. And sure, he can be strict, he can be academic, and he can be your, you know, stern teacher. That's fine. But he can also be an entertainer. He can just be a sort of almost like a carefree virtuoso who wants to just sort of thrill you with his skill. He can be the most tragic poet, and he can be the most brilliant philosopher, and he can be all those things in one piece and almost at the same time. You know, it's like, it's unreal when you sort of just realize that these structures are poems, you know, and that they so easily can reflect the human condition in me and you. That happened when I was 14 with the Goldberg Variations, and I started to learn them, and I didn't play them in public until 16 years later when I was 30, and it was out of respect. I just knew that I wasn't ready with them. And I played a lot of other Bach, but not the Goldberg Variations in public. played them when I was 30, and they became a calling card. You know, sort of. My career really started in my early 30s, and this was a really important piece. The piece that Universal Deutsche Grammophon heard me play in a tiny little concert in Berlin, etc. And
Really?
it started that whole chapter in my life, or those chapters, I should say. And but then I took a break from it because something about this piece, the fact that I see it as, it sounds childish, but I think of it as the greatest keyboard work of all time and perhaps the greatest musical work I know of all time.
Yes.
Because of that kind of like burden of association.
Yes.
It almost becomes a trial where you are sort of the prosecutor and the judge and the defendant. You know, you put yourself on the line with the Goldberg Variations, and I thought, I want to do something special for my 40th birthday year, and I want to take a break from the sort of big industry, all the symphony orchestras and this kind of normal seasons. I just want to be alone with my suitcase, with Bach, with myself, with the studio, with my family, but take a break from it. Play this one piece on a pilgrimage, just like a workaholic's year off, workaholic's sabbatical, playing 100 concerts. But that's how I saw it. And I thought, now I'll record it. I'll face my trial. I'll see where I stand with this material. But once you have recorded it and started the tour, of course, you change your mind infinitely many times about how the music should actually go. So I'm actually thinking about sort of jumping into the studio at the end of the tour now in June, which is basically in a month and a half.
Yeah.
And just recording them again.
Yes, great idea.
Why not?
Great idea.
I know they will be different.
For sure. They can't help but be different.
Yeah. Maybe you should just come to Iceland then and
You never know.
and be a part of that.
That sounds
adventure.
like that's a good reason to come to Iceland.
Yeah, I can see it. We can have fun with the microphones together.
How far in advance did you decide, 40 years old, Goldberg Variations? Was it, did it happen quickly, or over years had you been thinking about it?
You know, I was thinking about it over the years and sort of leading to this point in time for, I would say, 5 years. I've been talking about this sort of privately to my team for 5 years.
Yes.
I love thinking in those kinds of blocks and trying to understand the different chapters of my own life, even if we can't. But I think it's important to at least show interest in the different chapters and not just do things on automatic. And I've been thinking about turning 40 and looking around in my profession of music, but of classical music. And I see very often, and also in any music actually, and you see so often people have these creative periods very often in the 20s and sometimes in the 30s.
Yes.
Beyond 40, it certainly happens, and you can see incredible creative growth after 40, but very often it's not the case.
Yeah.
Very often people settle into a kind of mode of themselves where they have defined themselves perhaps too much, and they don't challenge that definition, and lifestyles become slightly nicer, you know, everything becomes a little bit more luxurious, and, you know, big bands sign contracts not to go too far away from proven success. You know, it's a deal with the devil. But I think about this all the time, and I think about it, how many composers, performers, bands, musicians, colleagues do I see that I really look up to in a creative sense in this early middle age, if we call it like that.
Yeah.
You know, how many people manage that? Because I think the tendency is that you would just become like a luxury handbag, like a Gucci that's being sold by managers to promoters, and everybody is very happy about it because the leather is so fine and the seams are so seamless, and it's a gorgeous little thing, you know, but it's a handbag. It doesn't.
And the bag is empty.
The bag is empty. Exactly. So I think you know, the artists that we all loved, you know, are the ideological artists. People like, in my realm, people like Glenn Gould. You know, there's no one greater in that sense from defining the performer's creative and sometimes compositional, basically, role in music. In the composer sense, certainly, of course, Johann Sebastian Bach, but also Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, who was a late bloomer and not very much a prodigy in my mind, you know. And you have people like Igor Stravinsky, you have Ludwig van Beethoven, who seems to, with every work, challenge the foundation of his whole musical worldview. Can we do that in 2024? I don't know, but I think we have to push in that direction.
I think it's definitely possible.
Yeah.
I think part of it has to do with dedication. One of the things that I see with artists as they get more successful and grow up, their life becomes more complicated, and music is no longer the most important thing in their lives. And it's a thing they do. It's a thing they do full time.
Yes.
But their home life, and it makes sense, you want your home life to be fruitful and important and the center of your life. But that's also at the expense of the obsession with the work that you had when you were younger.
Yeah.
But I think there's a wisdom comes through experience, and there's an energy in youth that can't be recreated, but there's something that comes from wisdom that's, I'll say, equally magnificent. It's just different.
Yeah.
And we can embrace it. But I think also the dedication aspect of it is absolutely key. If you don't treat it as the most important thing, it won't be, and it will diminish.
Yes. Maybe it's okay to have a nice home, but so many other things you can get rid of.
Yeah.
I think
and know that when you're doing music, you're really doing music.
Yeah.
You're not, one foot is in home and one foot is in the music, and you really can be there when you're there. It's really about being present, being in the moment.
Getting rid of your smartphone, I think, as well. It's a good idea.
Yeah.
Hard thing to do. No, I'm trying to sort of think about my next 10 years from 40 to 50, what should happen, what I want to do, I keep going back to my beginning, to composing music, to opening up to I've done some of that, of course, but I used to do quite a lot of that when I was just a kid. But that's perhaps why I turned so much to Bach as well, because I feel that is sort of like a compositional outlet in the comfort zone of somebody else's notes, It's a protected environment.
How do you think composing impacts your playing?
I think from composing,
yes,
which is a scary thing to do, because you have an empty page and everybody knows that. I think when you have to make that journey from point A to point B to C, you then start to think differently about the music of other people that you play, and you start to automatically deconstruct it and think about how it might fantasize, how it might have been written, which is a fantastic thing. And when you look at, for instance, Beethoven's sketches and you see some of his processes, they're so clumsy at the beginning, and he starts with these kind of super clumsy ideas, and then he just works and works and works and works until he's happy with what he's doing. And sometimes I like that, sort of to decompose the music and try to imagine, what if I don't know the next note? Or the Goldberg Variations, what note should come next? And then that note, of course, takes on an added significance once you then play it and understand it in that context, as opposed to recreate what you heard in a recording from Glenn Gould when you were 14, That's a very important part of looking at it from my perspective. But there are different schools of thought about that, and many people in classical music hate that kind of, they think it's almost frivolous to allow yourself that perspective and to almost think and feel almost like a composer when you're working in the music of others, because they think that there was a very 20th century idea that the performer in classical music is a humble, dedicated servant to the great master, the composer who died 100 years ago, But I think to those people, I say, have you tried working with living composers, and some of the best living composers in the world, because they change their minds about tempos, about narratives, about notes, about everything. Of course they do from day to day. It's not. So working with a living composer certainly makes the dead composers much more flexible I think it's a beautiful thing then to open the Bach Goldberg Variations or Beethoven sonatas, having just come from a session with John Adams or whomever, Philip Glass or something, So yeah, I think my favorite performers in history, many of them died before 1950, because at that point in history, in the early 20th century and certainly in the 19th century, the performer was almost composer as well. That was just part of like your musical foundation. You wrote music and then you could become a famous pianist by playing the music of others. When Rachmaninoff plays the music of Chopin, it's the most authentic Chopin playing I know, and it's certainly my favorite. Sometimes he takes things and turns them upside down, and a forte becomes a piano, so loud becomes soft, and he really takes a lot of beautiful compositional liberty. He makes the music his own. It really becomes a meeting and a dialogue between Sergei Rachmaninoff, the pianist, and Chopin, the composer. But it's so authentic. And so, and look at Vladimir Horowitz, at the end of his life, he said he had one regret, which was not to have composed more, because he always played the piano like a composer. That's what people forget. Not just like a great virtuoso, he played it like a composer. And that's, I think, what so many of the really big communicators in classical music, I'd rather call them almost communicators than performers, because performer is such a boring word. Communicator is, I think, more what it's about. Why they've so often had that dimension of a composer's perspective.
Would you say the composer brings something less technical to the picture?
How do you mean?
Is it some other thing? Is the pianist the technical adept?
Like the craftsman, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the composer goes beyond that, because composers don't care about the craftsmanship, of playing an instrument most of the time when they're in the act of writing. Of course, you have to write in such a way that it's possible to play it, but yeah, you go beyond that. You go beyond the act of executing a skill to the source of inspiration and the root of the music, perhaps. So yeah, I'd say so.
Tell me a little bit, if you can, about the history of recorded classical music.
Well, it's I should have prepared before I came here. All right, let me masterclass you on this.
As you know it, walk me through.
Well, it starts with Bach's Silenters, doesn't it? But I think there's a general attitude in the beginning, in the late Deutsche Grammophon. My record label is actually, I believe, the oldest record label
it is
in the world.
I believe it is.
How old is it now? Well, it keeps getting older, doesn't it? But it's
128 years, something like this.
Something like that.
A lot.
0.5 probably on the they're always counting, But yeah, it's in any case, I think it's maybe 1898. That's going to be my guess, and now everybody can go and Google that, But really at the tail end of the 19th century, and it's beautiful to listen to those recordings. It's almost like shouting, like, "Can you hear me?" There's so much noise.
Yeah.
It's just like you're sort of in the middle of some disaster, but during that disaster, someone is making music, and it's a fascinating thing. But relatively quickly, of course, things became more advanced, and we really start to see classical recordings that we can actually listen to. I'd say already in the 1920s. That I have many records from that time. The problem with recording for so many decades of recording was that the performers were afraid of the microphones. They hated the microphones, and they saw it as almost like a duty, like paying taxes. That you have to do it, but you don't enjoy doing it. And I think very often they felt slightly inhibited and afraid of, errors and mistakes and wrong notes and scratches and whatever. So I think for the longest time, there was a sort of an apprehension, that kind of like a lack of trust.
And do you think it's because in that case, the performance lives on versus the temporal nature of doing a concert, and tomorrow that music from last night is over and now you get to do it again?
I think so, and I think it's because it's a very sort of comparative art form that you're using the same text from night to night, from pianist to pianist. And so how is my Chopin Minute Waltz going to compare to that person's recording of the same piece? It's I don't like comparison in art like that. I think it's actually the enemy of art, but it's sort of inevitable when you're having the same score, especially when you're committing it to record. So yeah, I think the moment when this changed was actually going back to our 1955 encounter with Glenn Gould in the Goldberg Variations, when 22-year-old Glenn Gould takes this piece that was absolutely outside of the performed repertoire. Nobody took that piece seriously as a concert piece. It was just seen as almost like a philosophical statement by Bach, rather than the work that it actually is. Do you know how many times he recorded the opening aria of the Goldberg Variations, a piece that is not, you're not going to play so many wrong notes in it, are you? I can't remember, it was 19 or 21 takes of the aria. He doesn't even do the repeats. So the piece is 2 or 3 minutes long. It's a serene aria, but it's a change of direction in the way we see the studio and embrace the possibility of that art form and define it as its own art form as opposed to a byproduct of and something you have to do on the side of playing concerts.
Did he ever talk about that? Did he ever talk about the thought process?
I'm not sure. He loved to talk about the studio, but he always scripted himself. So
I just wonder if he was listening maybe to jazz records or things that would inspire him to do what he did.
How did he come up with it? It's a wonderful thing. I mean, to just because that's just new. If you take, because it's not about like hitting the right notes. It's a statement about idealism of the studio and to dare to go for your ideal in that sense. You know, to have the courage.
Yeah, it's not purely a document of one moment.
No,
you can go as long as you need to go until you get the thing you want to get.
Yeah, it's a creative process of the studio that you and I love, I think.
But probably before that, you believe people just came in, did their thing, were intimidated by the mic, and that was it. And that's all we had.
I think so. Yeah. It was also because the editing possibilities became so vastly better in the 1950s and maybe slightly earlier. But really, that's a turning point in time. So this whole goes hand in hand. But I think so many people like Rachmaninoff, and even if his recordings are unbelievably gorgeous, I think he suffered a little bit in the studio. We're like, oh, play this 3 times now, and hopefully one take will be both, glorious from a technical perspective and unbelievably inspired from a musical perspective. And it's just hard to get one take of everything you want in, when you're trying to match your ideal in every millisecond, microsecond of the performance. So, but I mean, how to talk about the 20th century? I mean, I think this is a real turning point. And then I think we have sort of a glorious period when you're recording almost anything, and if you're with the right label and with the right promoter, it just turns into gold. You could record almost anything in the 70s and 80s, and release it on Deutsche Grammophon, and it would just sell. And people were just doing these big symphonic cycles, and one after the other, and all the Wagner operas, and these huge, huge releases. Such a glorious time in a sense. But in another sense, it's also a rather automatic time from an A&R perspective, because I think the way people thought about recordings was a little bit like going to the library. You go into the alphabet, you find this author, and then you find all his works, and there they are, and they're presented like that. So if you're going to record the Chopin nocturnes, then you record all those nocturnes, and you always release them from Nocturne 1 to the last nocturne. And that's how you do it. And if you're going to do all the Bach inventions, these 15 inventions, you have to then do an album that's just the inventions. But people wouldn't shuffle. They wouldn't, they wouldn't look for unexpected context. They wouldn't see music history as that kind of a playground. That's a much more recent idea that started more in the 90s, and then it's been a wonderful period for that in the 21st century, because we've done all the catalog, and at this point, how many people are actually waiting for the next 32 Beethoven piano sonata cycles to be released? I'm not saying you shouldn't do that if that's what you want.
We're looking for the moments. We're
Yeah,
looking for magic moments. And the idea of combining the work of composers that are sympathetic, where you
yeah,
learn something new about one composer by what you play next to him.
yeah. I had a discussion with a wonderful musical friend in Iceland who was talking about shuffle and how much she loves to wake up and just open one of those streaming platforms and just start one track that she wants to listen to and then just see what the hell happens and allow that to become your day in one way. It's sort of like to take four or five random tracks. I think sometimes shuffle is the most wonderful thing about, you know, modern day listening, that you go into such unexpected encounters and you put music history in such new context. We forget it's a recent thing,
Yeah.
you know, and
Yeah.
people did not do that in the 90s. It's
Hard to shuffle an album, a vinyl album.
It's very hard.
Yeah.
It's hard. Or it's basically impossible. Unless you have a really good DJ. but certainly, so I think the way I've done my albums, certainly for Deutsche Grammophon, has been, it's like playlists that I spend like a year or two just forming before I even start to like work on learning the notes, you know. So I have many sort of playlists in my private sort of corner here, which I'm experimenting with. One of those was Debussy Rameau, where I sort of made Debussy, that everybody thinks is the great impressionist among composers, which is like the most superficial thing you can say, because he hated that term, by the way. But Debussy's roots were really in the French Baroque. So I sort of focus on the Baroque side of Debussy, and then I put him right next to Jean-Philippe Rameau, who was the enfant terrible, I think, of the French Baroque, and I focus on the futuristic and visionary sides of Rameau, and I put them in the same room together, basically, you know, 200 years apart. They're having a dialogue on that album, and, you know, my point was that you hardly know who's who, you know, and Rameau in 1760s write music that is so touching and futuristic that it could have been written by Gustav Mahler at the end of the 19th century, you know. And Debussy, you know, with all of his unbelievable sort of spacious harmonic inventions and everything that he brings, you know, new, he has that foundation of the Baroque, of the toccata, of the sort of motoric driving structure, you know. So I think very often we simplify history a little bit, you know.
How much earlier was Rameau?
Rameau was born 2 years before Bach, so 1683, sorry. And so basically, yeah, they're far apart, you know.
That's interesting.
1683. I think they're born about 180 years apart, but 180 years is nothing, you know. As the older I get, now I'm 40, I actually think 180 years isn't so much.
Yeah.
And I look back at Bach and I look back at Julius Caesar or Jesus Christ or something, and actually, it just seems a few grandmothers away.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
But
you think how much music has changed over the 40 years you've been alive.
Intense.
So if you can now add...
Intense.
Yeah.
It's hard to understand that.
180 years in music is a long time.
Yeah. Is it though? I mean, sometimes sometimes I love folk songs, not like cheesy, like stupid folk songs, but I love like folk songs about death and about like serious matters.
Yeah.
Folk songs about hunger. We have lots of those in Iceland for some reason. And what I like about folk songs is that they can't be composed by an individual, but they are sort of the collective effort of generations of a grandmother singing to her grandchild, who then sings to their grandchild. And something about these melodies makes me feel time in a strangely sort of compressed way. You feel like the essence of maybe 3 or 4 centuries, and all of a sudden they just become like this, which is how our lives are in, you know, blink of an eye in relation to the age of the world, you know, the age of Earth. So no, I don't think that 180 years is a long time, even in music, you know. But think about all the music that we don't know. Sometimes we think that people just started like hitting sticks, you know, but what the hell do we know about what people were doing there 20,000 years ago, you know?
We don't know.
Why do we think they were so primitive, you know?
Yeah.
I don't think so. I don't think we can prove anything.
No.
Imagine, what if they were singing these, making these unbelievable sounds together, these polyphonic calls, you know, to warn of danger. I mean, we have no way of knowing.
Yeah. How many pieces did Bach write?
Oof.
Loads.
Yeah, I mean, there's like 1,100 opuses almost, or, you know, they have different names, but they're opuses. But
all of them are recorded and made popular, or no?
No, but they're all pretty good. I mean, they're all basically poems.
Yeah.
That's the strange thing about him. Something about the structural and side of Bach that opens, maybe we see them as poems because we reflect our own ideas onto the music as well, you know, but I think about him, and I think about the fact that he had no audience. He wrote this music, like the Goldberg Variations, for nobody. You know who Goldberg was? 14-year-old kid.
Really?
Yeah. He wasn't the guy who paid for the variations.
Wow.
Goldberg, I think Johann Gottlieb Goldberg, I think I'm saying this correct. He was a 14-year-old, very gifted student of Bach's, harpsichordist or instrumentalist. And the Goldberg Variations were written for a guy whose name was Kaiserling. And he was a count, a sort of an aristocratic man, some sort of a diplomat, I think, who had insomnia. He couldn't fall asleep. And he commissioned Bach to write him variations to sort of soothe his sleepless nights. And this little Goldberg, as the story goes, had to take a room next to the count, and whenever the count would sort of like crawl, like, oh, I can't sleep,
he would play
me
the music.
variation 13 or whatever.
Wow.
Poor little 14-year-old Goldberg would have to sort of go there and sort of during the night play
That's
this
a great
for the
story.
count to fall asleep. But I think what I love the story on many levels, but what I really love about it is that the variations are not called the Kaiserling Variations, which would be a horrible name anyway. Yeah. But they're called the Goldberg Variations because they are the performer's piece. They become, you have to take sort of ownership of it.
Yes.
They become Goldbergs rather than Kaiserlings.
Yeah.
But think about it, Bach is there and he only has 4 books of music published in his whole lifetime. I think I'm saying this correctly. Meanwhile, you have the big superstar and almost equally wonderful composer, Handel, you know, Georg Friedrich Handel, living in London, I think the biggest name in music, you know, the Taylor Swift of his time or whatever. Yeah. And basically having that kind of glorious show business life that Bach never had. Bach was always stuck in Leipzig, you know. I think he was 3rd choice to become the organist of the Thomas Church, you know. People really didn't know who was there. He knew who was there, people didn't.
Yeah.
And he had to do so many things. He had to teach Latin, he had to teach violin, harpsichord, conduct the choir, blah, blah, blah. He had to do a million things. And then he also had to write like a big cantata, like a piece for like choir and little orchestra, sometimes every week for every Sunday, and like write out all these parts. And you just can't understand. Yeah. And a man who had, 20 children and 10 of them died. And just the kind of drama of this guy. And meanwhile, from the 21st century perspective, it's, to me, impossible to understand just from sort of a human ego perspective. There you are that creator, you are that musician, you're Johann Sebastian Bach, you're that man in history. How lonely must it feel to write the Goldberg Variations for a 14-year-old kid and a guy who wants to fall asleep? Yeah. Can we even comprehend that? Yeah. And the fact that he writes it not so far away, you know, from the end of his own life, and he had 9 more years to live, and his health was starting to deteriorate. Old music didn't exist as performing music. You know, you wouldn't have concert music with anything that was written older than 1 or 2 years, mostly something that was written for the occasion. It was just all new music. Mm-hmm. And there you have created these, 1,100 pieces or more indeed. And they're of that level. And you're at the end of your life and you have no idea whether anyone will ever know anything about this.
Yeah.
Well, if we just take it on a human level, of course, our own lives, however famous we might become during our lifetimes, they're a bit like this, because we're all going to be forgotten in, just a few years. Yeah. But how did it feel still for Bach to look around and to see the success and the fame of perhaps lesser composers? Yeah. To have this, well, he writes at the end of every score, S, D, G, Soli Deo Gloria, glory to God. It was a ritual, a religious thing for him to. Yeah. But I think, I think he was a very devout Christian, but I also think he needed that even more because of what he was creating for no audience. And this piece, the Goldberg Variations.
Obviously, he was creating it for an audience because of what he wrote at the end. It was devotional.
Yeah, that's right. But I just sometimes think you spoke about the modernity of this and about Bach, and I think that it's a letter to the future.
Yeah.
It's a letter that he actually puts in a bottle and he floats it on the ocean, and it finds us all these years later. And I was, talking with John Adams. We were by coincidence in Barcelona together in November, and John, from a very sort of composer's perspective, he said to me, how many times are you playing the Goldberg Variations this year? And I was like, 96 times or whatever it is, and then John just looked at me and said, I just wish Bach got some of the royalties. Which I love that, right? But he's right, and I just think, like, if Johann Sebastian Bach knew what kind of a role his music plays in the lives of people in the year 2024, how he's I think, I was just discussing with my friends at Universal Music, I think Bach is the biggest composer on the streaming platforms. Yeah. But there's a reason for it. It's because his music works equally well almost, whether you go into very deep, intense listening to only that. But the incredible thing about the kind of structure of Bach is that it also allows you to do something else and sort of elevate the environment meanwhile. And then you can zone back in and you can get so much from it, but somehow it gives you freedom to lead your life in another direction and still have him be a part of it. So I think that is key to him. But I often think about him, and I feel a kind of brotherhood with him, and I feel for him.
Hearing the story about Glenn Gould at 22, finding the Goldberg Variations, a more obscure work, and it becoming the Goldberg Variations that we think of as the Mountaintop. And if there is as much Bach material as there is, might you find your Mountaintop in that music that becomes the twin Mountaintop that doesn't yet exist?
Second Goldberg Variations?
Well, it's not the second Goldberg Variations,
but I know what you mean.
Do you know what I'm
something like that?
Can you find what of importance is unheard in Bach's work, and can you create the performance of it that sets the standard of this is one of the great works of all time?
It's a dangerous thought, because if you go there, I think your middle age, my early middle age, ego takes over, and you start to define yourself and hope for your place in the canon, like all white men think about at some point in their lives. And I think
I'm saying it as for Bach, though, not for you.
Are you thinking for him that he could?
No, I'm saying if you do that, that's the greatest gift you can give to Bach.
Yeah, I think you can do it, but you can only do it. What I'm trying to say is you can only do it by not thinking like that, because once you think like that in such a canonic way,
I see. That makes sense.
I think your subconsciousness and your creativity is going to get stifled.
Yes, it can be undermined.
I'm actually convinced about that.
Yeah, it's too big of a goal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because that's the mind frame of the young man, I think,
Yes,
or the young
yes.
woman, a young
Yes,
artist.
yes.
They want to go there in history, and you want
Yes.
to. That's why it's impossible to sort of do the Goldberg Variations. And I waited until I was 40 because it becomes that trial.
Yes.
But it's nice to have done it once, so you can do it again and then forget about the trial. But yeah, I think it's absolutely possible to redefine this work. But while you're doing it, you're probably more aware of other things than the fact you're doing it. You know, you're probably deeper into the music than that, you know. But it's a very interesting thought, actually. And it's very
I like the
tempting.
challenge of it. I think it's a great, and again, I'm not thinking of it in terms of the canon or in terms of competition. I'm thinking it in terms of the legacy of Bach.
Absolutely.
And the fact that if there are lost, beautiful moments, that the only reason that people don't know them is because no one is shining light on them.
But it's for sure, there's a lot of those things because...
Has to be.
Absolutely.
Has to be.
Absolutely. And I
never would have had this thought if you didn't tell me the story of Glenn Gould doing the work, and it wasn't the position that we think of it now.
I know, I completely agree. But I think that basically when I play the Goldberg Variations, when I recorded them, I felt like the ink had just dried on the page. I felt the music was so new to me.
Yes.
You know, how do other people feel about it? I don't really care, you know, but that's how it was in my mind. And so if that is your feeling, you can hope that more people might feel like that, or they might not. But but that's a good feeling to have for yourself. You know, it's a good point in the creative process to find yourself in. You know, but yeah, it does feel like new music in a very strange sense that the music of Mozart doesn't feel, even if it's unbelievably beautiful and deserves...
I don't have the same connection to Mozart. I never have had the same connection to Mozart.
Well, I'll play you some Mozart later, you know, so to try to convert you there. But it's a different thing, you know, and he's not perhaps a part of our time quite in the same way that Bach becomes a part of our time. He's not the same mirror, but it's about also the idea of writing those kinds of structures as opposed to going more into the classical and romantic period when the narrative is perhaps more defined by the composer.
It sounds more like a time, whereas Bach sounds more... It's like math. Math isn't old or new.
Yeah.
It's when you see the equations, they just are.
Yeah.
It's like that. That's how Bach strikes me.
Yeah. He's the future.
Yeah. How did you choose Glass to start with? Your first album with Deutsche Grammophon is Philip Glass?
Yeah. Do you know Philip?
I've never met him. I'm a fan, obviously, from a distance.
Yeah, he's a wonderful man.
Yeah.
And I know him, but I knew him more back in those days. He was one of, could I say, like, early backer? I'm not sure. No, I shouldn't say that because, but he did invite me to perform with him on numerous occasions. I played with him joint concerts with more young pianists in London, in Sweden, actually in Reykjavik, Iceland. And I played the piano etudes, or the ones I really like and connected to, not all of them, and a piece called Opening for that album, which was released 5 days before Philip's 80th birthday. It was a rather extravagant, I thought, birthday present.
Beautiful.
To him. That was back in 2017. I recorded in 2016. Well, I like the idea of an offbeat entry into that oldest record label in the world.
Yeah.
You know, everybody, and I was already 32 years old at the time, so I wasn't exactly that young. And if I would have been 22 or 20 or 18 or 16, I probably would have really pushed for the Goldberg Variations or the Chopin etudes or whatever, something like how people are supposed to do it, you know. But I guess I was old enough to favor maybe a more offbeat and perhaps slightly riskier choice with these. But I really felt with that music that I didn't agree with recordings that were on the market.
Yes.
I simply didn't understand them.
Yes.
And the music spoke very directly to me, but it also spoke to me in a somewhat compositional sense. You know, working with Philip was very free because I played the music so completely differently from him.
Yes.
I remember I played for him Etude number 6, which is very fast, sort of repeated, sort of nervous etude, repeated notes, and this kind of beautiful, little almost Rachmaninoff feel to it.
Mhm.
And then he said to me, I play it probably 50% faster than his own recording or whatever. I played much faster, and he said to me, somebody should give you a speeding ticket, but it's not going to be me.
Yeah.
Which was beautiful and generous. He was saying basically, you know, you shouldn't play it that fast, but I kind of like it. I think that's kind of what he was saying. I was allowing me to be me inside the
Yes.
music, you know, which is great. But he's also a performer, so he understands that you have to have that freedom to express something in music. You can't, yeah. And with that whole thing of minimalism, so-called, and well, let's call it music based on repetitive structures, where you have like one chord and then that measure repeats 4 or 8 times, a little sequence, and then the next sequence that repeats 4 times. Then you go back to sequence A and repeat that 2 times or whatever. So the more I started to play that, the more it freed me a little bit from the conventional narrative of going from point A to B to C, and how you see the kind of the narrative of a traditional piece of music or of a movie or of a book, just a storyline. You know, he doesn't go into stories like that. He creates space with these structures, and the more I started to sort of look and play this music, the more I realized that there is no such thing as repetition. It doesn't exist in music, and it doesn't exist in life. And it's not a matter of playing these patterns twice the same, but rather to find a new perspective on them and to allow time to pass and to allow them to evolve. And it's more like a painter who's working perhaps with the same subject matter, but always finding ever new perspective, you know.
Yes.
So that changed very much the way I saw it, and then it became a very interesting, for me, playground of exploring sometimes the essence of ideas. You know, these etudes, some of them are very simple, some of them are less simple, but he's very often exploring like one chord relationship, like 2 chords and how they relate to one another, or he's exploring how you play 3 notes against 2 in a kind of polyrhythm, you know, or 3 against 4, or whatever it is, you know. But he's taking these kind of musical elements and he's sort of zooming in on them and giving us the essence of those elements. And I started to really enjoy this because it became an exploration of, well, those musical ideas, but also of space, of the acoustic, of the instrument, of the color of the pedal. And the pedal of the piano is not something you just press down. It has, you know, so many different variations inside, you know, and how much you lift the dampers, you know, how you work with sound. It became an exploration and sort of etudes in musicality and in improvisation almost, you know. And I would go on stage with those etudes and I'd just play them completely differently, you know. I'd really sometimes build a narrative just using those structures almost like they were just like my ingredients, you know.
Yeah.
And so when people listen to those recordings and then they look at the score, they're like, what the hell is he doing? And some people hated me for it, but others didn't, you know. And but they're like, I'm not following almost any of the dynamics, and you know, sorry, Philip, I'm not following any of the tempo markings. I'm not doing almost any of the things that he writes in there because I didn't relate to the music using them, you know. But I related so strongly to the music in a more abstract sense, and I thought these structures and at their best are so phenomenally brilliant and beautiful and sort of so generous, you know. And they allowed me a little bit to be myself, and the thing is that he did allow me to be myself as well. At least he never really told me off. I haven't seen him for years now. I hope he forgives me about speaking so openly about this. I mean, I love the man and I love the music.
Yeah.
But that was an interesting thing. But I'll tell you something, you know, when I started with DG and recorded this, I was always going to do then Bach as my second album because it's sort of like the passion of my life.
Yes.
But I had this interesting moment, and I want to share it with you, and I want to share it with any like young artist who is perhaps starting out or finding their way. The success of the Glass album, and it was quite successful, almost became my enemy, because there were very strong voices within my label, which I love, my label.
Yes.
But at that point, early in my collaboration with them, they basically, I thought I had earned my right to do, you know, whatever I wanted to do as a second album. But they said no, because the album sold 7 times more than we expected and got these reviews. We realize now that you are this kind of fantastic pianist to play American minimalistic music. And I just remember my heart sinking, and I was just like, no.
Yeah.
That's not where this conversation is going. But we had quite a debate about it, and they really wanted to sort of like, not all of them, but many strong people at that point in the company wanted to place me in that, you know, context. So I was that guy for them.
Yeah. How long did that last?
Well, I actually threatened to leave and break up my contract if I wouldn't get to do my second album the way I wanted to do it, the Bach album. Yeah. And by that time, I decided to do something completely different from the Goldberg Variations. I was in a different rhythm there myself. And then, you know, when it really became, I'm leaving, I'll just do that album on Sony or whatever. Yeah. Of course, I won that battle. And then turned out that Bach, of course, the second album was, I mean, infinitely more successful than the first one. Yes. And then I had the same conversation. But then I was going to do a French album, and then they were like, actually, because we see now that the Bach album is so phenomenally successful, we see that you're a Bach pianist. I was like, well, yes, but and I actually like thought very early like how dangerous it is to have such a strong machine tell you who you are, and almost every artist goes through that.
Yes, it's a big part of my job as a producer is to talk artists out of those, protecting them from those voices.
Right.
Seriously.
Yeah.
Because it's there's something bigger at play than it worked last time, so let's do the same thing again. That's almost never the best idea.
No.
It's usually the worst idea. I remember the very first album I ever produced, a rock album, was a group called The Cult from England. And they came and they said, okay, this is going to be they played me some songs and like, this is going to be our first single. And I said, well, how do you know that? We haven't even recorded them yet. And he's like, well, it's got the same chords as our last single, and that was a hit. And I said, well, if it's got the same chords as the last single, it can't even be on the album.
Oh my God.
It can't be the next single. No. It can't even be on the album.
Oh, so depressing.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I mean, I almost get nervous like from hearing something like that. Because you're like, yeah, you're going to screw your career in life, and your music is just about to die. No, but I think that, you know, you have to, for the longest time, in a way, make sure you are always ahead of everybody else about who you are and where you're going. But you also have to escape a little bit success. You know, early on at least. You know, you have to, and maybe always.
Yeah.
To move away.
Well, you don't aim at it. You aim at what's good. And that's the thing. Usually the reason you become successful is because you're making something really good.
Yeah.
And if you focus on making something really good and continuing to make really good things, it usually works out.
Can you imagine that it becomes like these horrible, like Fast and the Furious 8 or Fast and the Furious 9 or whatever? I mean, I saw the airplane yesterday. I was like, they've actually gotten to what, 10 or something? What a horrible concept. It wasn't even good in the first place. but it's like, if you had imagined like Beethoven writing like the Fifth Symphony, like using the same chords.
Yeah.
Just, oh my God.
It's very funny.
Yeah, no, but I think, but that I want, I'm happy to share that. At the same time, I just want to say like I love my label. It's like, it really has become like a family to me, you know.
One of the things about Deutsche Grammophon that's so impressive is I don't know very much about classical music. I love listening to it, but I know very little. And if I hear a piece of music I like, and I want to go back to the past and find a great version of a piece, if I see the Deutsche Grammophon logo on anything, I know it's a good place to start.
Yeah.
I don't know if it'll be the best version, but it will definitely be one of the best versions.
There's something about it. Yeah. This yellow label.
Yeah.
It's
got great power.
It has something.
And I think it's the only, well, in a modern way, ECM also has this for me. Like
Yeah.
ECM records have a sound.
I love them.
They feel like they're not just part of everything else.
I love that
it's
label.
got
Yeah, I'm a big fan.
yeah, but I think those are the only two that I know of in the classical world that have that where it really matters.
Some people are gonna cry at Sony right now. Or Warner. No, there are great people everywhere. Come on,
and
there are great labels as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. But there's something about the history. You know, there's something you can feel that history.
Yeah, it is. It is. Well, what surprised me when I came there first was how young the people are who are working there, and you know, you don't join them because of the history. You don't join them because of Horowitz or something like that.
No.
You don't do anything because of the past. You do it because of what's happening now in the present. But it does still have this aura.
Oh, absolutely.
And
it's in the same way that, yes, Carnegie Hall sounds great.
Yeah.
But if there was another theater that sounded as good in New Jersey, an hour away, it wouldn't be Carnegie Hall. There's something about the ghosts of these places. Same
Didn't they
true.
do that? I think they tried to rebuild some of those houses somewhere in East Asia or something. I mean, or was it in Japan? I think they tried to take like the Musikverein, this legendary hall in Vienna.
Yeah.
I think they rebuilt it somewhere, and it sounds completely different.
Yeah.
Even if everything is the same. It is. Well, thank God.
No, it's magic. There's the reason I asked about Disney Hall is that's one of the concert halls that was built based on computer renderings, and in recording studios, the ones built on computer renderings of what's best for sound don't necessarily sound as good as the old studios that were built with a different understanding of acoustics.
Yeah. But also wood and concrete and everything that goes into a house.
Yeah.
You can't escape time, and you can't buy time. You can't skip time.
No.
Things change. The old pianos, the old violins.
Yes.
You can't buy it.
Yes. I remember hearing that James Brown said he would only record in a studio that's on the ground floor.
Oh, really?
If the studio wasn't touching the ground, he didn't believe that the music could come through in the same way if you recorded it on another floor. Interesting.
Probably right.
It's interesting. It's interesting to consider.
Wow. Yeah, took my mind away a little bit. Yeah, no, absolutely. I'm just thinking, I'm recording on the second floor. Shit.
Like, time for new studio.
I was actually on the ground floor.
Is the studio you're building going to be on the ground?
Yeah, under my house with natural light blowing in, you know, from basically like the grass is here and you have these windows, and then I've really gone deep.
Oh, great.
Yeah, it's going to be
maybe
beautiful.
Underground's even better. We don't know. That'll be a good.
We'll find out.
We'll find out. Yeah.
No, I'm very excited about it, but it's also just it's a new chapter of changing the ratio in my life between the concerts and the recordings. I wanna spend much more time with the microphone.
I suggested the Bach idea, and you said it was a dangerous idea. As soon as you said it was a dangerous idea, I knew it was a good idea.
Yeah.
If the first word that comes to mind is dangerous,
yeah,
it's a good sign.
It's a good sign.
When making something.
It's a good sign.
If the idea is dangerous, it's worth looking at.